In the middle of the United States, far from the Pacific coast, far from the Hollywood image of cracked highways and swaying skyscrapers, there is a fault system that almost never makes national headlines, and yet may be one of the most dangerous earthquake zones in the country. It sits beneath quiet farmland, river towns, highways, bridges, pipelines, rail corridors, and millions of people who do not live their daily lives thinking about earthquakes at all. That is exactly why it matters. Because the greatest threat in this story is not noise, it is silence. Scientists are not warning about a fault that is constantly shaking itself apart in public. They are warning about a fault system that can stay quiet for long stretches, hide beneath thick sediments, and still hold enough energy to turn one of the most populated and infrastructure-heavy regions in America into a catastrophe zone when the ground finally moves. Most people assume that if the most dangerous fault in America exists, it has to be in California. That assumption feels intuitive. California has the San Andreas. California has the history, the movies, the public fear, the building codes, the drills, the identity of living with seismic risk. But what if the most unsettling earthquake story in the country is not the one everyone watches? What if it is the one sitting under Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, southern Illinois, and the surrounding region, in a place where many buildings were not designed with the same level of seismic protection, where the fault lines are buried and harder to study, and where the shaking from a large earthquake can travel vastly farther than people expect? Stay with me, because by the time we are done, you will understand why scientists keep returning to this zone, why the next disaster here would not look like a California copy, and why the real warning is not that the new Madrid Seismic Zone is loud. It is that it has the ability to stay quiet until it matters all at once. The New Madrid Seismic Zone is the most seismically active area east of the Rocky Mountains. That fact alone should make more people pause than it usually does. This is not some fringe geological theory. This is a long-studied earthquake zone in the Mississippi Valley, defined by several fault branches running through northeastern Arkansas, southeastern Missouri, southwestern Kentucky, and northwestern Tennessee. Scientists monitor it constantly. Small earthquakes happen there every year. Most are too small to be felt. Some are tiny enough that only sensitive instruments catch them. But the quiet movement of small earthquakes is not the main reason this place is feared. The fear comes from its history, from its geology, and from what modern hazard assessments say could still happen in the future. Because when the New Madrid Zone woke up in the winter of 1811 and 1812, it did not produce one memorable earthquake and go back to sleep. It produced a sequence, a months-long chain of violence that included 3 very large earthquakes, estimated between magnitude 7 and 8, surrounded by hundreds of moderate shocks and thousands of smaller tremors. Think about that for a moment. Not a single bad day, not a single terrible minute, a season of shaking, a repeated assault on the land itself. The first major shock struck on December 16, 1811. Another major event followed on January 23, 1812. A third huge shock hit on February 7, 1812, and in between, the region kept shaking. The fear did not arrive and leave, it lingered. The eyewitness accounts are part of what makes this story feel almost mythological, and that is dangerous in its own way, because mythology can make real hazards feel less real. Survivors reported tremendous roaring sounds, visible waves moving across the ground, fissures opening in the earth, and whole areas sinking or rising. The crew of the steamboat New Orleans reportedly tied up to what they believed was an island in the Mississippi, then woke to find that the island had disappeared beneath the river. Large parts of the surrounding landscape were disrupted by landslides, sand blows, subsidence, uplift, and flooding. The shaking was felt astonishingly far away. Damage was reported in places like Charleston and Washington, D.C. People in the eastern United States who had never imagined that the center of the country could send that kind of shock through the crust suddenly found out otherwise. And this is where the story begins to bend outside the usual disaster script. In the western United States, people are used to the idea that California gets the big earthquakes. But earthquakes in the central and eastern United States behave differently. The geology is different. The older, colder, more rigid crust allows seismic waves to travel much farther. That means a large New Madrid earthquake would not just be a local crisis. It could shake an enormous region. Geological agencies have emphasized that earthquakes in this region can shake an area approximately 20 times larger than earthquakes in California of similar magnitude. That number changes everything, because once you understand that, you stop imagining a disaster limited to a single metro area and start imagining a chain of impacts spreading through multiple states, river valleys, transportation routes, and older built environments far beyond the fault itself. Now here's the part many people miss when they hear that comparison. Bigger shaking area does not simply mean more people feel it. It means more systems enter the danger zone at the same time. More bridges, more schools, more hospitals, more water mains, more gas lines, more substations, more counties trying to coordinate the same emergency across different states with different resources and different vulnerabilities. That is why central U.S. earthquakes are so difficult to think about correctly. They do not only threaten what sits directly above the fault, they threaten the wider web connected to the fault. A California earthquake may hit harder at the epicenter, but a New Madrid event can spread serious consequences much farther through the heart of the country. That difference is not academic. It is the kind of difference that determines whether a disaster stays regional or becomes national in its implications. That is one of the most important reasons this zone is so unsettling. The danger does not concentrate neatly. It radiates. It travels. It reaches farther than instinct says it should. In scenario modeling for a magnitude 7.7 earthquake on the southern section of the New Madrid Zone, scientists have shown how shaking can be focused and prolonged by the real foot rift and the soft sediments of the Mississippi embayment. That softer material amplifies motion and traps seismic energy, stretching the duration of long-period shaking in some areas to around 30 to 45 seconds, including places like Memphis, Little Rock, and Paducah. 30 to 45 seconds may not sound like much in conversation. During strong ground motion, it is an eternity. It is enough time for unreinforced masonry to fail, for bridges to be stressed, for water systems to rupture, for people to lose balance, for panic to spread, for fires to start, and for every weakness built into the landscape to announce itself at once. Now here is the part that should reframe everything for you. Scientists are not telling this story as a legend from a harsher century. They are telling it as an active hazard. Hazard estimates for the New Madrid Seismic Zone suggest a 25 to 40% chance of a magnitude 6 or greater earthquake in the next 50 years, and roughly a 7 to 10% probability of a repeat of the great 1811 to 1812 sequence in the same time frame. No, that is not a prediction of a date. No one can tell you the year, the month, or the morning, and anyone claiming they can do that is not doing science. But probability at this level is not something you wave away either. It means the zone is not dead. It means the risk is serious enough that federal agencies, state emergency managers, seismic researchers, and regional planners have spent years trying to model what a modern event would do. And what a modern event would do is exactly why the silence is so dangerous. In 1811, the central Mississippi Valley was sparsely populated. Today, millions of people live in and around the reach of the New Madrid system. Major cities like Memphis, St. Louis, Little Rock, and Evansville sit within the broader zone of concern. Highways, rail lines, pipelines, ports, and utility networks cut through or depend on areas vulnerable to strong shaking, liquefaction, and prolonged disruption. Old buildings still stand in many places, especially unreinforced masonry structures that are notoriously vulnerable in earthquakes. Rural areas may not have the skyscrapers of Los Angeles, but they do have bridges, levees, hospitals, schools, warehouses, industrial facilities, and communities that would be deeply exposed to a long-duration, widely felt central U.S. earthquake. And unlike California, where earthquake awareness is built into the public imagination, much of the central United States does not carry the same everyday culture of seismic preparedness. That difference matters more than most people realize. A hazard is not just geology. A hazard is geology meeting human systems. It is not enough to ask how large an earthquake could be. You also have to ask how ready the people, the buildings, the roads, the emergency services, and the economic networks are for what that earthquake would demand. In California, decades of repeated experience have pushed building codes, retrofits, drills, and public memory in a certain direction. In the New Madrid region, awareness exists, but it has not shaped life with the same intensity. And that means the quiet years themselves can become part of the danger. The buried nature of the fault system makes the story even stranger. In places like California, faults often leave visible signatures near the surface. People can point to scarps, traces, and obvious geological expressions. In the New Madrid Zone, thick layers of soft river sediment bury the fault structures beneath roughly 100 to 200 feet of alluvium. Surface evidence erodes quickly or gets hidden by new deposits. That makes the fault system harder to study and less obvious to the public. Out of sight is one of the most underrated forms of risk amplification. When people cannot see a danger, it becomes easier to mentally demote it. The landscape looks ordinary, the farms look calm, the river keeps moving, life feels stable. Meanwhile, the fault remains there, concealed beneath the soft sediments that also make some earthquake effects worse. Those sediments matter because they do more than hide the fault. They change the shaking, the ground response, and the damage pattern. Loose, water-saturated sediments are prone to liquefaction, a process where shaking causes the ground to temporarily lose strength and behave more like a fluid. That is how land can crack, slump, spread laterally, and sink. That is how roads warp, foundations fail, pipes snap, and levees become vulnerable. During the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes, vast areas of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys were affected by fissures, sand blows, lateral spreads, uplift, and subsidence. Millions of acres were disrupted. That was in a much less developed world. In a modern event, those same processes would interact with dense infrastructure, flood control systems, industrial sites, and transportation lifelines across a region whose economy depends heavily on the river corridor. And this is why the New Madrid story becomes more frightening the longer you sit with it. It is not only a seismic story, it is a systems story. A large earthquake here would not just shake buildings, it would test interstates, freight routes, pipelines, communication systems, power grids, ports, bridges, water treatment plants, hospitals, warehouses, levees, and emergency coordination across state lines. The impacts would not remain local and neat. They would ripple through supply chains and transportation networks in ways that most people would only understand after the fact. That is one reason earthquake planners have treated the New Madrid scenario so seriously. The central position of the zone means the consequences would spread through a part of the country that quietly carries a huge amount of logistical importance. Now let me take you back to the numbers, because the numbers help pull this out of the realm of abstract fear. Some scenario estimates tied to a major New Madrid event have projected direct regional economic losses in the hundreds of billions of dollars, with hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes. State-level estimates in Missouri alone have pointed to tens of billions in direct economic loss and tens of thousands of damaged buildings under a large event scenario. In parts of the Boot Heel and nearby counties, older emergency planning reports estimated that a powerful New Madrid earthquake could kill fractions of a percent to several percent of local populations, depending on county, seriously injure many more, collapse large numbers of buildings, and leave others with severe structural damage. These are not throwaway numbers. They describe the kind of damage that does not simply get cleaned up in a few weeks. They describe a regional transformation. But here is the part that often gets lost whenever people hear worst-case earthquake numbers. A modern New Madrid disaster would not only be about the headline magnitude. It would be about the mismatch between the event and the region's assumptions. Buildings not designed for prolonged lateral shaking. Communities without a lived memory of recent major earthquakes. Old masonry still in service, critical facilities built before current seismic thinking, businesses with no continuity plans, families with no water stored, no communication plan, no understanding of what to do if bridges fail, power goes out, and the phone network collapses. The earthquake itself would be the trigger. The unpreparedness above it would decide how much worse the aftermath becomes. This is why scientists and emergency planners are so careful in the way they talk about the New Madrid zone. They do not say it is overdue in the sensational sense. They do not say a date has been written in stone. There is real scientific debate over recurrence intervals, fault behavior, and how to interpret the paleoseismic record. Some evidence suggests major earthquakes similar to the 1811 to 1812 sequence have happened repeatedly over the past 1,000 to 2,000 years, with rough recurrence intervals on the order of several hundred years. Other scientists have debated whether the fault system may be evolving differently than a simple average recurrence would imply. That uncertainty is real. But uncertainty does not equal safety. In fact, when people hear scientific uncertainty, they often assume the threat is being downgraded. In hazards like this, uncertainty can mean the opposite. It can mean the exact timing is unknowable, while the consequences remain severe enough that the only rational response is preparedness. That distinction matters so much that it is worth saying plainly. The danger is not a countdown clock. The danger is a probability attached to a system capable of extreme consequences in a region that does not wear that risk on its sleeve every day. That is why the silence is the danger. The fault does not need to advertise itself constantly to remain threatening. It only needs to remain capable. And the evidence says it is. That is also why long, quiet stretches should never be mistaken for proof that the system is fading away. Quiet is not a diagnosis. Quiet is just the condition in which people either prepare seriously, plan honestly, or drift back into denial. Now think about the cultural side of this for a second. California earthquakes dominate the public imagination because they have image power. People picture freeways, fault lines, and television helicopters. New Madrid has almost the opposite profile. It is easy to ignore because the setting feels too ordinary. Quiet farmland, river towns, Midwestern and Southern communities, grain silos, highways, levees, train lines, low skylines. The visual language of the region does not scream seismic terror. And that is what makes the story so unsettling. America's most dangerous fault is not in California. The most unsettling part of that sentence is not the danger. It is the contradiction. Because contradiction forces the audience to admit they may have been watching the wrong place all along. And once that contradiction lands, every other fact grows more powerful. The central and eastern crust carries shaking farther. The faults are buried and harder to read at the surface. Liquefaction and land failure are major concerns. The region includes millions of people and major infrastructure. The zone has already produced catastrophic earthquakes in recorded history. The probability of damaging future earthquakes is not trivial. And the culture of everyday preparedness is not shaped by constant earthquake awareness the way it is in California. Stack those facts together and the silence begins to feel less like calm and more like a blind spot. Let me show you why the historical sequence still matters so much. The three major earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 are not merely dramatic anecdotes from an underdeveloped America. They are the strongest real-world proof that this system can produce very large earthquakes at all. Without that sequence, the region would be harder to sell as a major hazard in the public imagination. But history removed that doubt. It showed the fault's capacity. It showed the scale of land change. It showed how far the shaking could be felt. It showed the Mississippi Valley can behave in ways that seem almost impossible until they happen. The earth rolled. The river changed behavior. The land tore open. Those are not rumors. Those are reminders. Now here is the part that should make modern viewers most uncomfortable. If the 1811 to 1812 sequence happened in today's built world, the human consequences would not be defined by log cabins and scattered settlements. They would be defined by dense transportation networks, urban corridors, industrial dependency, vulnerable structures, and cascading disruptions. The old stories would become new systems failures. A collapsed bridge now is not just a local inconvenience. It can sever freight movement, delay medical transport, block emergency response, and isolate communities. Broken water systems are not just unpleasant. They cripple hospitals, sanitation, fire suppression, and public health. Damaged levees are not just engineering problems. In a river-dependent region, they can compound flooding risk on top of earthquake destruction. That is what makes this kind of hazard so severe. It multiplies through networks. And when a network disaster hits a region that did not emotionally expect it, confusion becomes part of the damage. People do not only need strong buildings in earthquakes, they need strong scripts in their heads. They need to know what to do in the first seconds, the first hour, and the first day. Drop, cover, and hold on. Protect your head and neck. Stay away from windows. Do not run outside during violent shaking. Expect aftershocks. Have water, medication, flashlights, backup power, and a family communication plan. Secure heavy furniture ahead of time, not after. Anchor water heaters and shelves. Know how your home would actually behave if the ground moved hard for half a minute or more. These steps sound small, even boring. That is always true before a disaster. After a disaster, they become the difference between inconvenience and catastrophe for thousands of people at once. This is one reason the New Madrid story is so compelling. It is geology, but it is also history. It is disaster science, but it is also human systems. It is a quiet landscape carrying a violent memory. It is an American heartland story told with the logic of a thriller. The deeper you go into it, the more it pulls the audience forward with harder questions. Not just what happened, but what it means. Not just what it means, but who is exposed. Not just who is exposed, but whether the quiet itself has been training everyone to underestimate the threat. So let me answer the question some viewers are already asking. Is the New Madrid Seismic Zone truly more dangerous than California's major faults? That depends on how you define danger. California is unquestionably more active, more visible, and better known. But if you define danger as the combination of a proven large earthquake history, a wide shaking footprint, vulnerable sediments, buried faults, weaker preparedness culture, older structures, and the ability to disrupt a massive multi-state region, the New Madrid belongs in the most serious tier of American earthquake risk. That is why scientists keep watching it. That is why planners keep modeling it. That is why emergency managers keep drilling for it. Not because it is guaranteed to go next Tuesday, but because its consequences are large enough that ignoring it would be reckless. And there is another layer of danger that rarely gets enough attention: businesses. Small and medium-sized businesses often carry the illusion that disaster recovery is mainly a public sector problem. It is not. When power is down, roads are broken, water is disrupted, employees are displaced, and supply chains seize up, businesses start failing fast. In disaster planning literature tied to the region, the warning is blunt. Many small businesses do not reopen after major disasters, and many that do reopen still fail within the following year. That means a new Madrid earthquake would not just damage buildings, it could hollow out local economies long after the shaking stops. Stores, farms, transport firms, clinics, factories, and service businesses would all be forced into the same brutal question at once. Do we have a plan? Or were we assuming this would never really happen here? That question is the true moral center of the story. Because earthquakes do not decide whether a region is psychologically ready, they only reveal the answer. The next great New Madrid earthquake, whether it comes in years or decades, will not ask permission. It will not care whether the region had a short memory. It will not care whether people were more afraid of coastal faults than inland ones. It will not care whether officials delayed retrofits because the last big event was too long ago. It will simply test what has been done in the quiet years, what was delayed, what was ignored, and what people convinced themselves could wait. And that is why the silence is the danger. Silence gives people permission to postpone. Silence makes preparation feel optional. Silence turns probability into background noise. Then the ground moves, and all the delayed decisions become consequences. There is a tendency in hazard storytelling to end with either panic or dismissal. Both are useless. Panic burns fast and prepares poorly. Dismissal prepares nothing at all. The better response is seriousness. Seriousness means understanding the difference between prediction and probability. It means accepting that uncertainty about timing does not cancel certainty about exposure. It means recognizing that the New Madrid Zone has already shown what it can do. It means taking the central United States as seismic territory, not seismic exception. And it means acting before the next sequence writes itself into the national memory the same way the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes once did. If you live anywhere near the broader central Mississippi Valley, or anywhere in a structure that would not behave well under strong shaking, there are practical things that matter far more than doom scrolling. Know your safe spots. Secure heavy shelves and water heaters. Keep a real emergency kit with water, food, medications, batteries, flashlights, and copies of critical documents. Have shoes near your bed. Learn how to shut off utilities if necessary. Make a family communication plan that assumes cell service may fail. If you run a business, think beyond insurance. Think about backup records, alternate suppliers, staff accountability, and how long you could operate with broken transport and power. These are unglamorous steps. That is exactly why they work. Real preparedness is almost always less dramatic than the disaster it helps survive. And if you do not live in the region, the lesson still matters. The New Madrid story is proof that hazard and fame are not the same thing. Some threats dominate the conversation because they are visible. Others sit in the background because they are quiet, buried, and geographically unfashionable. But the Earth does not care about branding. The fault does not care what people find intuitive. It only cares about stress, structure, and release. One of the biggest mistakes any society can make is to confuse what feels familiar with what is actually most dangerous. So when you hear the phrase, America's most dangerous fault is not in California, do not hear it as a clever line. Hear it as a challenge to your assumptions. Hear the hidden fault branches beneath the alluvium. Hear the three great earthquakes of 1811 and 1812. Hear the Mississippi River towns that watch the ground roll and split open. Hear the modern cities and freight corridors now sitting in the reach of that same zone. Hear the 25 to 40% chance of a magnitude 6 or greater earthquake in the next 50 years. Hear the 7 to 10% chance of a repeat of the Great Sequence. Hear the 30 to 45 seconds of prolonged shaking that some scenarios project for key cities. Hear the part that matters most of all. The threat of the New Madrid Seismic Zone is not that it is loud. It is that it is silent. And silence in hazards like this is never the same thing as safety. It is simply the space where preparation either happens or does not. The fault will make its own decision in geologic time. The human outcome will be decided long before that, in the ordinary days when nothing is shaking, when the river looks calm, when the roads are open, when the buildings still seem solid, and when people still have the chance to prepare for a disaster most of them would rather not imagine. That is the real warning scientists have been repeating for years. Not that the heartland will definitely break tomorrow, but that it can break, that it has broken before, and that pretending otherwise is one of the easiest ways to make the next earthquake worse than it has to be.